I created this APA guide for the English language learner for two reasons. The first reason is really to begin a dialogue with other educators in order for us to reach some common ground as to what expectations we have from our students. The second reason for an APA guide is to detail a few common issues or common problems that I've come across over the last few years with our pre-service English language teachers who are studying in Mexico. There's some problems that have come up repeatedly over the course of the last few years from my experience. So this guide is to kind of detail some of those points. So we look at what is APA. I'll provide a link at the end of the presentation where you can access this site, and this is from the American Psychological Association, and they've provided a really good detailed tutorial for those who are becoming more familiar with APA. So this is just a collection of short videos, many of them under a minute long, where the learner can go through and learn more about APA. So this is a very good resource that I would recommend anyone who's interested in learning more about APA, and it's a place that you can refer to as you go through the writing process and you learn more about the formatting. So some of the questions really that we're going to address during this presentation are: how and when does one cite an outside source? We'll discuss the importance of being able to distinguish between original thought and one that is not, and how a reference is listed and when are they stated. What percentage of an essay should be original thought? And what aspects of APA require strict adherence in terms of evaluation? How are citations used within paragraphs that follow the meal plan? The meal plan being that every paragraph begins with a main idea or topic sentence. There is evidence that or details that support the main idea. There's some analysis or higher order thinking that's involved within the paragraph, again, that support the main idea. It also can be viewed as a way of linking the evidence back to the main idea. And you typically end a paragraph with a linking sentence that links either to the next paragraph or to some other part of the essay. So APA in the curriculum. How do we adhere to APA when there are so many versions out there? I hear this a lot, and I guess my response would be, I view it as basically there's one version of APA, and usually in each institution will maybe adapt their own interpretation. Maybe they will, for example, in the reference list provide double space throughout, or maybe they will have a single space within each reference and double space between each reference. So each institution will maybe take on variations of APA, but essentially there's one version of APA, and then finding out within the institution what areas of APA will be maybe adapted to local contexts. Which classes throughout the curriculum include the types of writing assignments that require APA? Again, looking at the whole curriculum, we wanted to identify which classes require essays that need to meet APA formatting. I think one of the discussions amongst the educators is going through the curriculum, identifying those classes, and then identifying the expectations or the criteria or the way in which we are to evaluate APA, again, either by level, by semester, by year, or if it's going to be a uniform requirement regardless of the level. Rubrics might be used. We'll talk a little bit more about those later. But again, this discussion is very important, again, so that everyone is on the same page as far as what the expectations are from our students whenever they write essays that need to meet APA standards. What types of writing assignments warrant APA? So again, we're typically talking about academic writing, not so much creative writing such as poems. So typically within this context, we're talking about academic writing, again, where a degree of research is required and where citations and references are required when bringing in expert opinions or evidence, again, to support ideas. So the idea here of working together with colleagues and determining and deciding on what is expected as far as APA is concerned can also be blended into the same types of conversations we would have when we work together across the curriculum to come up with common assessments or keystone assessments. So this is not an isolated conversation. This can be blended into other types of conversation, again, to assure that assessment in general is basically that there's a standard, or that that the teachers are requiring basically the same from all the students. So getting to know APA, we have some changes here. The 6th edition that came out, I believe, in 2010 underwent a few changes. The first being the running head on all pages and header is in all uppercase lettering. So before, the running head was only on the title page, but now it will be included in all uppercase lettering in the header of your document. So then it will appear on all subsequent pages of your essay. Another change was an increase in the words required to write an abstract. Before it was 120 words. Now they've increased that to 150 to 250 words. The city and state are now required for book references, for example, regardless if the city is popular or not. So before, where you might put just New York and then the publisher, now you would put New York, comma, New York, or you can abbreviate the state, followed by the publisher. So now both the city and the state are required for all references, or all book references. The digital object identifier now is being used as a way to standardize and basically create a permanent link, or a permanent online link for journals. And so now the digital object identifier, or the DOI, now is used instead of the actual link. All headings are in boldface. So the only bold required for the document are headings, but this again can be level 1, or level 2, or level 3 headings. We typically deal with only 3 level headings, but there are 5 headings in total, and according to APA. But all headings now are in boldface. Regarding a level 1 heading, all words are capitalized, and a level 1 heading is centered to the page. A level 2 heading is a subsection to level 1. Only the main words are capitalized. It's left justified, and it is on a separate line. A level 3 heading is a subsection to level 2, and it's indented as part of the paragraph. Only the first word is capitalized, and it requires a period at the end. It is no longer required to include a database when citing or referencing a journal, whereas before you might include EBSCO, ERIC. Now that is no longer required. It's also required now that there are 2 spaces after a sentence. So after a question mark or a period that concludes a sentence, 2 spaces are required. Leaving a retrieval date is now optional. If you think that the link could change over time, then you are encouraged to include the date. Important sections within the APA style include manuscript structure and content, coherency and cohesion, mechanics, crediting sources, and referencing. There are other sections, but the main point being that APA is not only about citing and referencing. It has some other valuable information about linguistic devices, avoiding bias in your writing. And so it's important to look at APA as a reference for not only citing expert opinion or outside sources, but also as a means for checking grammar and grammar structure and mechanics. So how and when does one cite an outside source? So when you write a sentence, ask yourself, is this original thought or is it not? If it's an original thought, you don't need a citation. But if it's not an original thought, if it's not common knowledge, then you do need to cite. And I've provided here 4 different types of citations that can be used. So the first here, you'll notice, starts with a phrase with the author's name and the year in parentheses followed by a comma. Okay, this ellipse here is an error, so just disregard this. So imagine the quotation mark starting immediately after the comma here. So you would provide your direct quote here and then finish with the page number, or in the case of a website that does not have a page number, you would abbreviate paragraph, P-A-R-A period, and then provide the number of the paragraph where you can find the direct quote. Second example here is similar, but instead of a direct quote, you are now paraphrasing. This third example begins now with a direct quote, and the author, year, and the page number fall in between the parentheses, ending with a period. The fourth example is a paraphrase followed by the author and the year within the parentheses with the period at the end. One of the things we'll talk about here in a few minutes is the preference between one type over the other. For example, writing according to Perry in this case, or putting the author's name Perry within the parentheses. How are references listed and when are they stated? So we can look at 3 examples here, and the 3 examples that we deal with mainly are articles, books, and websites. There are many other types, but for the sake of time, we'll discuss the 3 main types that, again, that we face in working with our students. So starting off with articles, you begin with the author's last name, followed by a comma, first initial, and a period, followed by the date in parentheses, followed by a period. Then the title of the article, title of the journal, and the volume number, both italicized. The issue number, which is not italicized, in parentheses, followed by a comma, and then ending with the page numbers and a period. If the article has a DOI, you conclude by adding the DOI number. Okay, here's an example of a website reference. You begin with the author's last name, first initial, the date within parentheses. The title of the article is italicized, ending with a period, then retrieved from, and then the link. Now the author, we start with the author's last name with the first initial, the date in parentheses followed by a period, the date, the title of the book, this is a typo, in parentheses followed by a period, then the city, comma, state, which can be abbreviated, colon, and then the publisher, and finishing with a period. So APA implies a consensus, as we've already mentioned, with regard to other areas related to writing. So it may be another course in psycholinguistics, applied linguistics, where they're required to write some sort of paper that must adhere to APA. So again, the idea here is to start a dialogue working with educators, other teachers, and basically coming up with the criteria that will be used to evaluate our students' work. What percentage of an essay should be an original thought? There are many opinions regarding this issue, but as a general rule, I ask my students to at least provide more than half of what they say as an original thought, and that's, in my personal opinion, quite low. But basically what we want here is, what we want to try to avoid is every single sentence being a citation, and that the students are expressing their own voice in their own words and their own thoughts throughout the essay, and that the expert opinions are inserted to support their argument. What percentage of an essay should be made up of direct quotes? So really, it's not so much what percentage of an essay should be made up of direct quotes. I would probably say that you should not have more than 15% of your work as a direct quote. How are citations used within paragraphs that follow the meal plan? So we discussed earlier the meal plan being the main idea, evidence, analyze, and link, and each sentence within your paragraph relate to one of those four aspects. So typically what we instruct our students is that the evidence part, the details that support the main idea, are typically those sentences that require a citation. That doesn't necessarily mean that you can't use citations for other aspects of the meal plan, but as a general rule, the evidence part does require a citation. What aspects of APA require strict adherence in terms of evaluation? So again, this will depend on the local contexts, but it's been my experience, some main issues with APA, or some main things that students need to stick to, are making sure that every sentence has a citation when it's coming from an outside source. One of the misconceptions or misunderstandings with regard to citing from our students is that the citations will be inserted after 3 or 4 sentences of actually citing. So they don't cite every sentence. They may cite it one time at the end of the paragraph and think that it applies to the entire paragraph, or it may apply to 2 or 3 sentences prior. And the idea here is to do away with that misconception and to explain that we need to evaluate or look at each sentence, and if it's not an original idea, there needs to be a citation. So moving on from getting to know APA, we're going to discuss briefly now my personal top 10. These are issues that I've come across in my classes, some common mistakes or errors, or some common issues or challenges that our students face. And one of them being the active voice with the non-referential it. It has been found, it has been seen, it has been known. So APA does suggest that the active voice should be preferred, and so we spend a lot of time working with our students and trying to help them write more in the active voice than the passive. It doesn't necessarily mean we avoid the passive voice, but many times, especially with the non-referential it, the idea is to keep in the active voice when at all possible. Headings are a problem, and not so much just the formatting of the heading, but the actual concept itself. Being able to come up with ideas when you have 3 level headings, for example, where you have one general idea that leads to a more specific idea, as in the case of a level 2 heading, then on to a more specific idea for a level 3 heading, followed by then topic sentences that are ideas in themselves that link back to, in this case, a level 3 heading. So it's a challenge for students to be able to come up with an idea and make sure that one idea is not too specific or too broad. Citing at the sentence level, just as I mentioned before, so making sure that each sentence has a citation when it's not an original idea. The meal plan, just making sure that each paragraph represents only one idea, and that all of subsequent sentences within that paragraph relate to that one idea, that you're providing details and evidence, that you are linking that idea back to the main idea, or analyzing, perhaps comparing and contrasting ideas, and that you are linking, that there is a level of cohesion between paragraphs. Spacing is a problem in several aspects. Spacing between words, between sentences, and between paragraphs. Margins and indentions, so we have 1-inch margins all the way around, and we have 1/2-inch indentions. Every paragraph in the document requires an indention, with the exception of the abstract, the serial comma. This is a common problem because in Spanish, in our context here, the serial comma is not required, the comma before the word and. So if you're writing, I like apples, oranges, and bananas, Spanish, the comma after oranges is not required. According to APA, we need to have a comma before the word and. So I like apples, comma, oranges, comma, and bananas. Okay, I mentioned earlier about the 4 different ways that you can cite, and I have listed here according to versus focus on concepts. The idea here is that we want to focus more on concepts than on the authors. And what I mean by that is we want to cite more with the author's name within the parentheses and avoid overusing according to this author. So again, the idea is to focus more on the concepts than on the author. Original thought and direct quote percentages. So again, as we mentioned before, that we have enough original thought as a general rule, over 50%, and direct quotes, no more than 15% direct quotes. And finally, fonts. 1 font, Times New Roman, font size 12. The tendency is to either mix fonts or experiment with different types of fonts in different sections. And along these same lines, we want to avoid writing words in all uppercase lettering. So as we conclude this APA guide for the English language learner, we may ask, well, what's next? And some guiding questions here as we go on and start working with other teachers and solutions, coming up with a consensus as to how we want to evaluate the APA. We might also consider what aspects of APA are necessary to avoid plagiarism, and are these criteria different based on the level of study. So there probably needs to be a minimum of APA that we're going to require. If we, depending on our students, depending on their level of knowledge, their readiness levels, we need to understand and accept a minimum of what we expect our students to be able to use. So, for example, if a student leaves out a citation, are those grounds for plagiarism? If it happens just once, or if it happens repeatedly, how many times does it happen? Is it a continual problem? But what are the ramifications for that? These types of questions need to be answered as an institution or as a department in order to make sure that the students understand first how to do it, and secondly that they are aware of what happens if they don't adhere to the APA formatting. And we also need to ask ourselves if the criteria is going to be the same throughout the curriculum, or if we're going to have different criterion for each level of study. What other aspects of APA greatly influence the way an essay is assessed? We might use a rubric, and that rubric might be holistic or might be analytical. It might be the same throughout the curriculum. It also may be different, as we mentioned before, based on the year of study. How long should essays be for each year a student is in the BA? So it depends on the year, depends on the program, a lot of different issues here, but from our context, this is a question that needs to be addressed just to assure that we're not requiring too much from students from lower levels, or perhaps we need to increase the expectations for more advanced learners. So how can we facilitate English language learners become critical of sources and become original thinkers when expressing themselves in their writing? So it's being able to look at an online source, an author, even a book, a published book, and understand prospective audience, and for them to distinguish between a source that's going to help them form their argument and one that's not. How can English language learners best learn about the resources available at their school? In our case, we have a virtual library, so we try to expose our students as early as possible so that they are aware of the tool and that they can use it in subsequent classes. How much class time should I dedicate towards APA? So regardless of the class, if you're requiring an essay that requires APA, it's probably a good idea to dedicate some amount of time in reviewing APA, reviewing your expectations, reviewing certain aspects of APA that are important that the students must adhere to. So how can teachers cooperate across the curriculum so that English language learners receive clear expectations as to how to use APA when writing an academic paper? This may mean teachers working together in meetings outside of class, working together on how to reach these expectations and how to explain these expectations or articulate them back to the students. So, what next? To be continued. We need to continue working together as educators and to make sure that they understand what's required with regard to APA. I thank you for your attention. Here are some references and the link back to that tutorial. Again, I would highly recommend all learners and teachers to refer to this link from the American Psychological Association, where they can find excellent tutorials on APA.